We are shifting the narrative in the Puget Sound. Here we go with Sound Shift Podcast. Tonight I took the time to sit down with Mitchimus Prime from TikTok. Now, Mitchimus is a local educator, and over the last year, a couple of years, he's been really struggling with legislation directly related to trans and LGBTQ rights, both for his students and for his own youth, as he came up here to Washington from Texas. I'm going to apologize in advance because the background noise is going to be kind of distracting tonight. We took the time to sit down and chat at the Coaster in downtown Puyallup. Now, I will say, if you hear music in the background, we had no control over that. I do not have the ability to pull that out of the audio for this recording. It is the background noise. Not really any different than any of the voices you hear in the background. I claim no ownership to the music that's playing in the background. I have no idea what playlist is playing in the background. It is just regular sounds in a very public space. Just a quick warning, the discussion tonight does revolve around LGBTQ issues and Washington state legislation. Some people may have trouble hearing some of these stories and some of these discussion points. If you're feeling overly sensitive tonight, please feel free to skip this or come back to it later when you're feeling up to it. And on that note, let's start the show.
You know, leaning into our discussion today, right? Mental health, right? So like people say that, we have this, I'm sure there's data that I haven't bothered to look at that would completely refute everything I'm about to say. This is purely anecdotal thinking with my ADHD brain and pattern recognitions, right? Do we have more of a crisis with mental health than we've ever had before? Or is it a combination of diagnosable, like the skills to diagnose, and the fact that we used to just let these people go? As in, like, there's a great documentary on Hulu put together by the woman who played Punky Brewster.
Oh, Soleil Moon Frye.
Yeah. So she put together a documentary that's on Hulu, and if you haven't watched it, bring the Kleenex, man, because it's devastating.
Yeah.
It turns out she grew up constantly with a camera in her hand, recording everything. And so this documentary is a supercut of all this footage that she collected from her time when she first gets the camera in the mid-'80s all the way through the '90s. And one face after another crosses her path of these tremendously gifted and talented people who commit suicide. And at the end, there's this graphic of these like 9 faces, and we're talking like all the big names. We're talking River Phoenix.
Yeah.
We're talking like two. Did you know that Soleil Moon Frye shared an apartment with like two or three of the kids from the movie Kids?
That's brutal.
2 of them committed suicide before it was all said and done.
Kids is definitely something that can't be recreated these days.
I can't watch it again. I watched it as a teenager, and I'd make fun of it because you don't know what else to do with what you just witnessed. But like also, it really highlighted like a real problem that we had ongoing in the '90s. Real crisis with addiction and mental health and suicide and all these harms that were being done. But if we're not capturing those kids into a system and diagnosing them, they don't become statistics. So do we really have a mental health crisis now that's worse than it's ever been? Or do we just have better systems to bring them in and actually turn their experiences into data?
Yes. However, so first of all, like the kids thing, I think we have a different perspective on that. Because when Kids came out, I was a street rat. Like I lived on the streets of Seattle.
I didn't live on the streets, but I definitely was hanging out with a lot of those street rats myself.
So like it was very much like the flop house mentality, the running around late at night.
Oh yeah, no, we glamorized it as kids. Like I was glamorizing it. Like this is something to look up to.
That's how I lived.
Yeah.
Like so I wasn't glamorizing it. I thought it was great to see myself and my friends represented on the big screen. I was like, this is normalized for me because that's what I was going through. But like on the other issue that you bring up, is mental health a new crisis, so to speak, right? No, not at all. In fact, mental health has been a big thing since like the 1600s. Have you ever heard of the Bedlam?
No.
So a lot of the time
I like to pretend like I did so I could sound smart.
We talk about Bedlam. If you were to Google it, Bedlam means insanity. Oh my gosh, this situation is Bedlam.
Wait. So you mean this term that we use to describe college football superficially?
Yes.
It's actually this really deep and serious term that we
absolutely.
are improperly using as a metaphor for sports fanaticism? Interesting.
Oh my God, this game is Bedlam. So Bedlam was actually the first mental health hospital It was over in like London or Europe or whatever. So what was started off was originally when we had a mental health issue or whatever it was that was the equivalent of a mental health issue at the time. So we didn't call it mental health at the time, right? We were just like, oh, this person has struggles, or this person has issues, or this person is possessed. Whatever it was the family that was in charge of taking care of that person. And that was very normal. Like the community would take care of this person. This person can't walk. The community is going to lift them up and make sure that they're fed, make sure that their ability, if you can't hunt, you're going to gather. If you can't gather, you're going to sit down and make the arrows. If you can't sit down and make the arrows, we'll give you a rock to smash slugs with. That was it, right? Like that was the community took care of its own. However, in the 1600s or whatever, the church came out and said, no, it's our job. God has told us that it is our job to take care of the poor and the meek. So we are going to take care of the mentally infirm as well. And the church built these nunnery hospitals. And these nunnery hospitals really were only taking care of like a dozen people. They were like, okay, this person from this community, this person from this community. We don't know how to approach the problem they have, but we can make sure that they're fed and they're clean and they're in a safe environment. But then the crown, or what we would call now the state, stepped in and said, no, it's not the church's job, it's our church. It's our job, right? Because the church and the crown were fighting over jurisdiction, so to speak. They were like, no, you're not in charge, I'm in charge. And the state, or the crown in the UK, started the Bedlam Hospital. But the thing is that the Bedlam Hospital, all it did is literally like nail people to walls, because it was a storage facility. And you had like 20 nunneries or 20 these like monastery hospitals that were taking in a dozen people each. And all of a sudden you had one hospital that was taking in 200 people. The 200 of the worst cases. And they didn't know how to deal with it because we had no understanding of mental health at the time. And they would literally just like nail people to a wall and leave them there. This continued up until the late 1800s. And then in the late 1800s, we ended up with this more therapeutic idea of you just need to rest, right?
The rest cure that Charlotte Perkins Gilman famously writes about in Yellow Wallpaper, which I have used in my classrooms every year as a teacher.
If you were rich enough, instead of getting nailed to a wall, you would be dressed in white playing croquet on the lawn.
Or, as Perkins Gilman writes about, you're locked in a beautiful bedroom that you literally crawl around on the floor going insane, and you're trotted out for everybody to see in public like everything is fine here. Your job is to show up and smile and be friendly and happy, and then we're gonna lock you back away again.
So the other option, now we're talking about American healthcare now, because this is when we start to see what happens in America separate from what happened in the UK. Eventually it bleeds together because it's a whole global thing, right? But like the other American option was the Whole House revival with, I think it's Jane Addams. I might have to correct myself later. Jane Addams is one of the first social workers in America. Now, Jane Addams started this Whole House, H-U-L-L, Whole House. Now, the Whole House idea was these are folks that don't have enough money to go to either of these places. They're not high need enough to be nailed to a wall. They don't have the money to go to the rest place, the whatever it's called. So they just opened a house. And they were like, we've got like 20 people. They can live in this house. And so, but the thing was that they wanted to give people also fulfillment, right? So you say, okay, not only are you here and we're taking care of you, but I want to make sure that you have responsibilities so that you feel fulfilled. So we're going to have you sweep the floors. We're going to have you make the dinner. We're going to have you do the gardening, right? We're going to have you doing the household chores. But this became such a thing where everybody was taking care of each other. They actually started having the people who were there clinically were doing such a great job of taking care of things that they started taking care of each other. They started like making sure that they were doling out the medications. They were checking on each other in their sleep. They were making sure that they could use the restroom. And it got to the point where the community around this house were coming there for dinner because the folks that lived there were making dinners big enough for the whole community to come to. So we have the Bedlam model, which was storage. We have this rich model where you're just playing croquet on the lawn. And then all of a sudden we have this community model, right? We did not approach that again until after World War II, because World War II was the first time that we had to recognize that mental health was a normal issue, because all of a sudden we had all of these people coming from World War II with post-traumatic, or at the time it was called shell shock.
And the greatest density of population that we've ever had.
Absolutely.
Because the Civil War, we're all spread out.
Yeah.
So it's easy for everybody to kind of be so spread out that like, you don't notice it as much.
Well, one, the big thing was you keep it to your fucking self.
Sure.
You keep it to yourself. What did you do over there? Wonderful things, and that's all we'll say. right? And Civil War, same thing. Every like giant event before that didn't really have this bring it home impact. But World War II, we saw people with shell shock. And about 10 years after World War II, we realized that that shell shock was presenting in wives. And we were like, oh fuck, maybe this post-traumatic stress syndrome isn't just limited to people who have been in the military. So we started diagnosing more people and more people. The mental health issues have always been there. It's just how we respond to them.
You know, in 23, before I left Texas, there was I kind of had my dream job in Texas as a teacher, and I'm still to this day very bitter that I got chased out of the state. You know, because I was teaching college level rhetoric, I was teaching creative writing, I was a soccer coach, I was a debate coach, you know, and I had this STEM focused freshman class in this little project-based learning pod inside of a larger campus. So like all day long, I'm in science fiction land, creative writing land, I'm coaching soccer, I'm talking big intellectual debate stuff with these incredibly gifted kids. Like, it was a dream position for me, and I'd been doing it for 2 years. But I had this kid that came through my creative writing class, and in the slam poetry team that I co-sponsored.
Yeah.
And she was from Nicaragua, and a brilliant graphic artist, right? Absolutely brilliant artist. And she was wanting to make a graphic novel. And she one day was telling me, she wrote this lovely bit for like a short story that was pseudo real. It was a rendition of a story her mom told us, you know, because her mom had immigrated from Nicaragua. And it's a story of a legend called El Cadejo. So El Cadejo is this essentially like a wolf beast-like spirit, right? That lives out in the mountains outside of these villages. And it's only seen at night and often only identified by its red eyes, right? And famously, it's, you know, a person from the village goes wandering off into the woods at night, and they encounter El Cadejo. And when they come back to the village at the end of the encounter, they spend months in total just darkness, you know? Some light of life is gone from their eyes, and they eventually die within months of this encounter. And it's told in different ways, depending on which region of Central America you're in. The El Cadejo myth holds throughout several communities in Central America. I've done a little bit of background research on it, helping this girl out. Because I told her, you know, of course, I'm a teacher and a creative writing teacher at that. And so I'm all about inspiring kids to pursue art. And so I really encouraged her to turn her mom's story into a graphic novel, right? I said, like, this would be a phenomenal graphic novel. And you know what's missing from the publishing world? Nicaraguan myth. Like, dude, you'd be telling do you know how marketable this would be? It's such a unique story. It's got a horror element to it. It'd be visual, you could play with it a little bit, like have fun with it. But after inspiring her, I walked away in thought. And at the time, my son's going through his own mental health crisis. I had a kid who spent a year starting at 10 years old and with suicidal nightmares that could not be explained until she identified as trans, and we got that kind of support on board. And it's night and day. Let me be clear, night and day. She's a totally normal kid who doesn't experience any of that. It's like the second we got her affirmed, a switch flipped and all that crap went away for her after a year and a half of it. For my son, cisgender dude, all of his struggles have nothing to do with being trans and just good old-fashioned fucked up mental health.
Sure.
Right? So my son's going through this crisis. I've had many students struggling with depression through the years and suicidal crises. And I thought, this sounds like a beautiful mythology to explain suicidal depression. And I started thinking about how many other mythologies around the world feature characters like El Cadejo, where people encounter them and walk away and die months later from the experience. I thought about Christina Rossetti's wonderful fucking poem, Goblin Market, about these two women who are friends in this village in England somewhere, who encounter the goblins in the woods, are tricked into what is through extremely beautiful fairy tale-like euphemisms for sexual assault and rape. And when these young girls are suckered into this by these goblins who promise them all these beautiful, juicy fruits, right? They always come back from the experience and die months later. Like the light is gone and they die. And that sounds to me like trauma. You know, like that's trauma that leads to depression and suicide. And I just think we've been wrestling with this problem for so long. We've never had the science to explain it. And where science lacks, mythology and faith fill the gap.
And that is a big thing too, because I mean, if we look at, so on the subject, because we're talking about like the parental rights and the trans rights, that like we know that, for example, the natives have the two spirit stories, and we're like, crap, they've talked about that. This conversation is not new, it's just new for us as predominantly like European culture.
European culture that comes from white Christianity that fled for being too unacceptable to the other churches that were in Western Europe.
Yeah. But so like every time that we talk about mental health, we've had this systematic approach, which has been based off of those two things, the church versus the state. But then every time we come in contact with another culture, that culture is like, we're totally okay with that. In fact, this is what we call it. This is how we respond. This is how we take care of each other. Not like how we put people away in storage, not how we put people out of sight, out of mind. But there's these very like pragmatic, important, interactive as a whole community, like interactions that they've had. And we're like, oh, like the closer we get, like the more advanced we get in our diagnosis, the more advanced that we get in our approaches, the more we realize that those are actually the appropriate ways to do things.
Yeah.
Spot on.
Think how much I've reflected on all this as an educator through the years, and then unraveling my whole family's history of just shit that's not even for this podcast. Really made all this stuff around these concerns about student mental health like front and center in my daily thinking and operation. Seeing that the state wants to do something like pass a bill like HB 1296 or 5181, protect the right of students, it becomes like a critical thing for me to see pass. I got here in the summer of 2023, right square in the middle of the petition signing for 2081. So you can imagine, I want you and your listeners to put yourself in the position of somebody who just left a state, packed up everything, cashed out his retirement from the state teacher to retirement system to pay for the move to get here, right? You've just unplugged from everything with one kid in suicidal crisis and the other one who needs to be protected as a trans kid. And you land in this state that's supposed to be a sanctuary and a safety for you and your family. And all around you are all the visible signs of that safety. My daughter goes to Capitol Hill for the first time 2 weeks after we got here. And we go to Twice Sold Tales and we just kind of walk around, and she never really...
Really quick, because you mentioned Twice Sold Tales, shout out to Disney.
Yeah. She never really commented very often, and still doesn't, on her own transness, really.
Sure.
For all that we've done as parents, a ton of advocacy, newspaper stories, interviews for stuff, podcasts. I've been in like 2 different documentaries as a cameo appearance about the fight for this stuff in Texas, right? Like, we agreed as a family to go to war over this stuff with the state of Texas, to fight for it with everything we had before we reached the place where moving was the only option left, right? We promised our kids we're not leaving the state until we've done it all. So put yourselves in that position and imagine landing. And the first thing you encounter when you go to a Target down the street is some jackwagon talking about parental rights on an initiative. Parental rights is a very specific language to say. It immediately made me go, shit, it's here too, right? My daughter just got done telling me that open mouth saying never comments on this stuff. And here she is telling me that like how much she really felt good coming out of Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
It made her feel good. These are her words, not mine, right? She never remarks on this stuff. It made her feel so good and so safe. But then we go to the store, and just standing out in front is this petition log filled with signatures for this parental rights bill that I immediately, of course, coming from the situation I just came from, immediately Googled when I got home. I was like, parental rights initiative, that sounds like a Trojan horse. What the hell is that? Googled it up and read it, and immediately was like, all right, who's the pack pushing this shit? I Google it, I read the language of this bill, and I immediately, because I know my business, start looking behind the scenes. Who the hell are these people pushing this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, who's pushing this narrative? Because it was one of those things where, like, when you explore it, most of it sounds sane and reasonable. But buried in it are just these 1 or 2 sentences that become the legal foundation for shenanigans, right? So
really quickly, before we go too much farther.
Yes.
Because you just lobbied, right? You just went down to...
Absolutely.
You just participated in lobby for trans rights, and specifically trans youth rights. Will you explain the general outline of the bills, just so that way our listeners have an idea of what's going on? Because a lot of people don't know that these things are a thing, right? Like, a lot of people think that this is a parental rights bill or this is an LGBTQ bill, but this is very much like a very mess. It's a mess.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think it's really critical, and God bless it. I brought this up to some folks when I was advocating on Transgender Advocacy Day, and I got a little roasted for it, but I do see, because I'm a teacher and a parent, I see beyond the needs of just my own trans kid. It is critical to understand that this the privacy of students and their rights to that privacy for medical and mental health that this bill is protecting are paramount to the safety of kids way beyond the transgender kid community.
Absolutely.
I would argue, in fact, that it touches on 10 times as many kids who are not trans than it does the trans kids themselves. Any attempt to push this bill by people on the right as a bill that provides gender-affirming care to kids is disingenuous at best and duplicitous at its most likely.
Yeah, no, because we did talk before this, and we both agreed that the idea that using the trans and the LGBTQ youth thing is a fear-mongering topic in order to control the narrative.
Right, because what these bills are really doing is protecting the right of kids to be able to be referred out to services. One, nothing in this bill provides funding for a school to hire staff paid by the district to do this kind of work. The school districts will not be hiring a doctor who just hangs out on site and prescribes meds.
No.
It is for schools like Seattle Public Schools that have third-party services they refer out.
Really quickly, just to make sure that it's very clear, because a lot of our, both of our folks that are listening to either our TikToks or our Facebook posts and all that, they don't really dive too deep. So the concept of the parental rights thing is that there is a big narrative that the schools are offering gender-affirming care. Now, we can argue all day about what that is, but there isn't really any gender-affirming care coming from the schools directly. There are teachers who are making sure that there's accessibility. There are teachers that are making sure that children have the voice to advocate for. But other than that, like, the schools aren't providing anything when it comes to gender-affirming care.
No, there was a recent report from, I can't remember if it was the Seattle Times or one of the other news agencies, that like Seattle Public Schools contracts out to a third-party medical services clinic. So a kid comes in, has a medical need that the counselors identify. They can be referred to this medical clinic where they can receive services. They were contacted by whoever this journalist was. The journalist directly asked them, do you provide these things? Then the clinic said, we might, and doesn't really say definitively that we give gender-affirming medical care. And I do want to be very clear, there's a distinction, and a distinction must be made because the GOP has made this distinction. And again, coming from Texas, it's the petri dish for everything else that might roll out. And there's a bill right now in the Texas legislature that would define gender-affirming care as not just medical services, but also, as we all knew, was already kind of inferred in the original bill on 23 that made me leave, also mental health, as in mental health professionals cannot acknowledge a child's preferred names or pronouns in their care. So that the only treatment for gender dysphoria that they're willing to accept as real is to help the kid learn how to not give into the gender dysphoria and take on a new gender identity, new in air quotes, by the way.
So one of the things about Washington specifically, and why this argument hits Washington so hard, is because we continuously use the phrase gender-affirming care. Now, throughout mental health,
that's a problem, by the way.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, so in Washington specifically, so gender-affirming care generally just means counseling or buying clothes or whatever.
It's a whole comprehensive term that covers the entire umbrella of the spectrum of care a transgender child might need.
Now, the reason that in Washington why we had this argument amongst and every other state is because our insurance billable states surgery specifically as gender-affirming care. When you combine those two together, it makes it very easy for somebody to just go, oh, well then all gender-affirming care must be surgery. But in Washington, gender surgery falls under the insurance billable for gender-affirming care, and we wrote that into an RCW a long time ago, the Revised Code of Washington.
You know, you actually just helped me kind of understand something a little bit, because there's some gaps for me being newer to the state and the history of the fight up here that I run into in my advocacy sometimes. So like when we were going through training for lobby days, and those of us who were willing to speak to journalists, we went through our own little bit of training from the Texas Education Network, Transgender Education Network of Texas. You know, they do train us on how to speak about things. They help us wrap our heads around rhetoric. And we actually were trained to specifically shift into discuss not as gender affirming care, because they felt that that was actually a really harmful label that was doing a disservice to the mental health piece.
Yeah.
And since medical care was what was on the chopping block, we shifted our language to transgender youth medical care.
Right, and that's the thing, right? Like, because
But not affirming care, because that actually becomes something you can argue.
Yeah.
But if you call it medical care, you're saying you can't argue with this. It is medically necessary care.
right.
And so we switched it. And if you go back and look at any of my posts online, you'll find I never say gender affirming care, and I always say trans youth medical care.
And I will say that
for that reason.
every time that I have discussed gender affirming care, I come at that from a mental health perspective and not a medical perspective, because I am not a medical person. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physician, I'm not anything that has to do with medicine. I'm just a behavioral health specialist. And so every time I've talked about it, I've said, this is gender affirming care. And in fact, I've thrown it out there that men's group at church, couples groups where, at church where they're like, okay, this is the wife's place, this is the men's place, that is gender affirming care. Now, when it comes to surgical intervention, that's out of my scope, but that is definitely a different thing, right? Like, so as a mental health specialist or as a behavioral health specialist, when I talk about gender affirming care, I'm talking about counseling. I'm talking about affirming somebody's actual pronouns. I'm talking about buying somebody a dress or buying somebody pants or making sure that we have individuals that are getting safe binders, because that's been a big issue too, is that
100%.
binders can be very dangerous if it's done at home, or if it's not guided, or if you don't have somebody to talk to about the appropriate way to do it. It can break your ribs. It could collapse your breathing ability, There's a lot of actual affirming care versus surgical intervention.
One of the most common questions that pops up in all the different online spaces for parents of trans youth is, hey, my son is looking for a binder, what do you recommend?
Yeah.
Right? And then there's always a bunch of people offering lots of really good support for that. Oftentimes people saying, hey, my son's going out of their binders, would you like, I can send them to you if you want them. That's actually really cool to witness, because it is a critical.
And I will fully admit that as a presenting male, I have not had to use a binder, and therefore it is not in my scope. But I have been very thankful that so many of my trans masculine brothers have stepped up and gone hey, these are the places where you can go to get a free binder. These are the places you can go to get sized. These are the programs that will help you out with that. And that's a Washington thing that I am very appreciative of.
Yeah. So, when we're talking about a bill like that, right, and they're talking about medical and mental health privacy of students, when they make the whole conversation about the transgender kids, it is honestly not digging into the full spectrum of those kinds of services provided. And I think, one of my goals in being able to talk to you today was to be able to share some stories and experiences that I've had as an educator, so that people understand what they're really saying when they say that this Parents' Bill of Rights shouldn't be amended, or that they feel like the way it was written in the initiative is necessary to maintain. And that is because, yes, there are trans kids harmed constantly by parents who don't affirm or support. But, and this is, again, something I will acknowledge speaking out of turn in the environment, and maybe it wasn't the place to say it, but I was thinking from the lens of somebody coming out of Texas that knows what it's like to try and have to shift a narrative to talk to a hostile audience. And so I offered some advice that I still stand behind, that if you are speaking to a potentially hostile audience, whether that is a Democratic representative or senator who is an unknown quantity for their support, or an outright Republican who maybe could be moved to see your side of it, but they need to hear something from you that allows them to enter into the conversation, that doesn't make them immediately put their hackles up, right?
Yeah.
Rhetoric, the art of rhetoric 101, right? And that is, I would venture to say, and I know it's not 100% true, nothing ever is, but I'd venture to say that there are not going to be that many trans kids who need to access some kind of support through one of these third-party systems that a school district might set up, where their parents aren't aware of their queerness. In a sense, I'm not saying that the parents support it. They might outright be against it, but the parents will be aware of it. Meaning, to suggest the narrative that's being sold that your kid could secretly transition without you knowing about it and never even realizing they're trans is, again, duplicitous, because that's not recognizing that most of us who have queer kids had an inkling that they were queer long before they come out. Now, my daughter shocked us. when she came out as trans, that was out of left field, really surprised us. But when our son came out as gay 2 years later, it tracked. You know what I mean? Like was it still a little surprising? Just in the sense of like, we had in 2 years of his sister being trans and him going through mental health crisis, just directly asked him a couple of times. Like, you know what I mean? Like we kind of had some reasons to suspect and had asked him a couple of times very directly. Like, you know, like he'd already seen us support his sister. So like, why would we not support him too, you know? But like, that means that the real concern isn't actually the trans kids. That's the story that gets sold to create.
Yeah.
The real problem is parents who know that they are harming their kid, who don't want to be found out for what they're doing.
Well, it's not.
And it is, or the case of my kid needs to be raised the way I want my kid raised.
Yeah.
And in my house, we believe in corporal punishment, or we believe in removing doors from the bedrooms whenever they get in trouble, or we believe in, you know, my parental right to like absolutely shit on my kid verbally if I want to. And in that world, those folks don't want to be confronted by a system that would tell them that they're abusive, because that would harm their entire internal identity of being good people.
So we have two situations when it comes to that, right? We all know that it's abusive, right? Like we're under this understanding that I'm going to beat the gay away is abusive. There is those same that same presence that I'm going to base that on my faith. I'm going to base that on my culture that has integrated people who would also assume that is abusive into believing that if they don't affirm their child's LGBTQ status or identity, that they are being abusive, right? That's what you hear a lot of folks say. They're like, no. If I am not okay with it, it's an abuse. Right.
Because, and this is where I try to get into their headspace when I think about this. Like, if you have been raised a certain way your whole life to believe a certain set of principles, and then discover that your principles were causing someone you love so much deep harm, the damage that would do to your ego. And I don't mean ego like pride ego. I mean just like truly psychological ego.
Like your understanding of
who you are as a person becomes completely shattered. It takes incredible strength to be a person to suffer that and figure out how to be a better person afterwards. And that's why I would argue that those people who project all that strength are actually the weakest people of all.
So I'm going to simplify this to the most simple version that I can try. So the conversation about spanking, right? We have two very different concepts of spanking. There is a quick swat on the butt, like you want to surprise the child so that they are paying attention to you while you tell them why things were wrong. And then you have the people who go out and drill holes in paddles to make sure that it pinches when they beat their child. And we understand that the difference in this is abuse versus parenting. And like, it might not be the parenting that I agree with. It might not be the parenting that is appropriate. However, it is a form of parenting. But that abuse and that parenting are both called spanking, right? And so when you say, I'm not okay with spanking, those people who only swat their kid on the butt to get their attention, they feel like they're being attacked over their ability to spank a child or swat a child. And those people who are beating their children are using that to their advantage to say, if they're coming after me, they're coming after you as well, because it's spanking undesignated, right? It's spanking in general. And so when we talk about like the abuse thing, so in a minute, we'll come back to the bill and talk about why the abuse issue is such a big deal. But when we talk about the abuse thing, we have people who are literally, I will beat the gay out of my child. And there are people who are, my religion makes me struggle with this and I'm not okay with it. And the people who will beat the gay out of the child are like, no, you're spanking your child too. And therefore you're in this fight as well. And so those folks who are just like, I'm struggling with this, are being told that they're abusing their child by struggling with it. And so they join the fight against it.
So when we're discussing a bill like HB 1296, to kind of get myself back on track, right? SB 5181, 1296.
And these are, just to be very clear, they are, I have not looked into SB.
They're not exactly identical, but they are companion bills.
Right, and they have the same intention and the same goals.
The same goals, right? They are amending the part of the parental rights bill that passed that deals with privacy of student information and data, right?
And these bills are the Democrat-written bills that the Republicans right now are complaining are trying to unwrite the past.
I mean, in a sense, it is writing it. As I understand it from my time in advocacy down there, right? So like when I began, again, I rabbit holed myself instead of staying on top of it. But like You know, I get here, I see this petition, I see the Trojan horse, I'm terrified that it's present, and I'm seeing no resistance. I'm not seeing anybody from the Democratic Party saying this parent rights initiative is a Trojan horse. I'm not seeing anybody raising any kind of stink about it being a problem. I'm seeing some school districts in the state, particularly in the central and eastern part of the state, wanting to do the things that Texas school boards are getting away with banning books. And I'm seeing all this happening as I arrive, and I'm like, holy shit, are these people this unprepared?
Yeah.
Like, are they really this unprepared for this war? Like, am I really about to be the Paul Revere riding in on my damn horse, ringing a damn bell of alarm saying like, I need you to hear what came out of Texas, guys. Like, you need to know it's here. And that it took Texas over a decade to pull off what they did. Like, it was a long con for them. Like, it took a long time, and it started with just 1 or 2 bills, but it raises the furor over time over these issues to a fever pitch that they then manipulate to get what they want. So I'm like, how is this state not defending itself against this? And honestly, until last week, had continued to haunt me. It was behind the scenes of all my thinking for the last 2 years.
Last week is when you went down to the lobby.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
For 2 years, I've been living, almost 2 years now, I've been living in this sort of haunted state of like, how are they this complacent in their privilege? Like, they feel like, job done, we passed our protections, guys.
Yeah.
We're good. And then here comes this executive order from Trump, right? And that got me active. So for most of that time, these last 2 years, I've been in healing mode. Literally the union president for the school district I worked for, when I went to new teacher orientation and I'm relaying to him my story and my concern, he looked me in the eye and made me feel safe as an educator and said, hey, look, we got you, man. Like, you've been carrying that sword long enough. Put it away for a bit. Let us be your shield, put away your sword, and just be here, you know? And it felt so good to have somebody, I teared up when he tells me this, like, you know what I mean? Like, I can't remember the last time somebody at a level of leadership had told me it's okay for me not to have to be the one to fight for a while. So I'd been sitting on the sidelines watching this and just haunted by this lack of defense. And so when I got active after the Trump executive order, one of my first orders of business is, what are the good bills? How can I support them? Who do I need to talk to? I started calling representatives all over the state. I talked to a staffer from Representative Lukinov's office because she was a co-sponsor on one of the good bills or whatever. And the staffer was like, hey, here's who you could talk to instead. They got me in contact with State Senator Wilson, went to her office, had a phenomenal conversation with her. She inspired my kid to apply for the PAGE program. Holy smokes, I love that woman.
Claire Wilson.
And then I got up there for Transgender Advocacy Day at the Capitol last week on Monday. And I knew that'd be a day where I could finally really get some answers. Because, those state senators, Claire Wilson was amazing, and I'll sing her praises all day, but she only had 15 minutes for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, very different experience, because in Texas, those offices are all open. Once you pass through security in the Capitol building, you can go barge into any office that has an unlocked door you want and go try and get somebody's attention.
Sure.
Right? I'm not used to regimented scheduling, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, because it makes it feel a little unapproachable to get a hold of these people. But anyway, that day though, I'm now in the midst of some of the power players of the lobbying and everything else. And I got some clarification on some stuff I didn't know. And it made me feel a hell of a lot better about all of this. Watching the Attorney General go to fight for my kid and being a part of that process already had me feeling a lot of hope that I hadn't felt in years. Seeing a political win in that courtroom hearing, I cried afterwards and the Attorney General gave me a damn hug. You know what I'm saying? Like, he saw me tearing up and he gave me a hug.
For those of you who are out of state who are listening right now, our Attorney General, who was our Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, is now our state governor. Our new Attorney General, Nick. Is that who you're talking about?
Yep, Nick Brown.
Mm-hmm. Nick Brown. Nick Brown is coming out of the gate swinging.
He's a superhero. His whole staff, superheroes.
Bob Ferguson has spent several years preparing for what was going to happen as if he was not going to win the governor's race. And now that he has won the governor's race, he's handed all of his work over to, not just handed, but like a warm handoff, made sure that Nick Brown is ready. And Nick Brown has picked up everything and hit the gate running.
They spent months pouring through Project 2025 and preparing briefs ahead of time to inform what they would then eventually do for actual court battles.
Normally, when
crazy
anybody leaves office and somebody else takes up office, they have to just kind of pick up whatever notes they can that were left around the office. But Bob Ferguson made sure that Nick Brown knew exactly what was happening before he left. And Nick Brown is picked it up and started swinging.
Yeah, and that's a whole other podcast to talk about that day in the courtroom, honestly. Needless to say, Trump sent his worst and we sent our best. So, I was already riding high with a lot of hope. And then to go for the advocacy day and get some clarity on some stuff that I didn't realize how much had been haunting me until I got the clarification and felt this immense pressure that I didn't know I'd been having sort of relieved. And it all goes back to this Parents' Rights Initiative 2081. Yeah. Why didn't we see a fight? Why didn't we see defense? Why didn't we? It was a plan. They knew what they were doing. They knew how to navigate and strategize to give themselves an opportunity to let this thing get through the way it was written so that there would be rules in place that would allow them to go ahead and much more swiftly amend it to clean it up. Because most of what's in the overall language outside of the student privacy piece is, as I heard you point out in your last podcast episode, most of the language from it existed in all these other statutes. And this just becomes a cleanup operation to streamline it into one piece of codified language. So they allowed it to go through knowing, really nothing is changing. All this stuff exists in all these other statutes. This just kind of codifies it all singularly, except for the parts that they are amending to clean up the damage.
So really quickly, the codify thing. The reason that you're always going to hear codify when we talk about the Parental Bill of Rights is because of the fact that when the Parental Bill of Rights, what was it called? Let's Go Washington. Yep. Let's Go Washington was the group that pushed the Parental Bill of Rights.
I'm sorry. I'm going to need you to clean this up. It's not Let's Go Washington. It's Let's Go Washington. You forgot the exclamation point.
No, I didn't. They just don't get the escalation in my voice. So the whole thing was that Let's Go Washington. I'm sorry. Let's Go Washington. No, I can't do it. Push this agenda that they were going to protect the parental rights to abuse children. And I will come back to that note in a moment. However, they pushed this right that it was the parental right to raise their kids as they see fit, no matter what. No matter what was the big push. And they put it in their website and they put it on all of their documents and their mailers that this is what they were pushing for. But when it came down to it, they pulled all of that language out at the last second before the bill got put in, or the bill got filed. And all the bill was a codification or the listing of existing laws, right? There was no new laws that were made from the Parental Bill of Rights bill several years ago. It was just, we're going to create this list of laws that are now the Parental Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights that applies to parents specifically. Now, the big thing that the Democrats are doing right now is in this push that everybody thinks is against Parental Bill of Rights is actually the codification of Youth Bill of Rights. Now, there are many things in this new bill that do restructure the original Parental Bill of Rights. However, there is an actual, I think, I can do a correction later, but I think it's 3.2 or something like that, is in this bill is literally a 10-point or 12-point or whatever new Youth Bill of Rights that says things like have the right to education that respects their culture. Youth have the right to access their necessary health care or mental health care. Youth have the right to jurisdiction with due process. So there are many things in this Youth Bill of Rights that come in conflict with the idea of the Parental Bill of Rights. The Parental Bill of Rights is not being undone. In fact, the new bill that is being put in place right now says that parents have the right to pick a school that reflects their culture and their beliefs to raise their children in. It doesn't say that the parents are forced into new cultures. It just literally says that parents have the right to pick a school based on these things. And that's really the majority of the conflict that's coming in place. Nothing ever said in the original Bill of Rights for parents that a child didn't have access to healthcare. Nothing ever said that a child doesn't have an age of majority when they get to make their own healthcare or mental health care decisions. But because it's being spoken out loud in this bill, people are like, well, this reflects against the original statements from the Let's Go Washington. Let's Go Washington never put that in their bill. They just put that in their propaganda.
So much of the stink that I see getting raised now is related to the 1296, 5181 companion bills. All the rest of that aside, right? This idea that a student can access some kind of mental health or medical service without their parents knowing about it,
Sure.
in order for them to to express and utilize their individual right as an individual to access that stuff.
Sure.
And anybody who is wanting to make this about abortion or trans care is not, as I've said a couple of times, and I think I'm now ready to get focused on this, are not focused on the real stories of kids who need to be able to access that when it's a situation that has not anything to do with those two topics at all. You know, there are situations where, you know, a child can be suffering abuse at a level that has them actively doing self-harm or thinking about self-harm or planning self-harm. And to express like what happens when a kid in that scenario can't do so privately. I had this student a few years ago. I'm gonna call her Birdie because I did call her my little birdie. Never to her face, but when I would tell my wife stories about my day, I would call her my little birdie because she used to come around my room looking for snacks and food, right? Now, this is a kid with a physical disability. You know, they have a prosthetic foot, a lower leg. One day I'm reading personal essays that the students have submitted, and I read stuff in this kid's story about themselves where it is dark. I mean, like, not like descriptions of what she would do to herself, but just really tragic levels of worthlessness, of having no value as a human being, and that they're not even sure why living is something they should even consider anymore.
Yeah.
You know, if any of your listeners ever want to know the true depths of what teachers receive from these kids, go find a friend who's an English teacher and ask them. We tend to be the first to read those in their poetry, in their short stories, and their personal essays. It's not because we are talking to them like therapists. It's because we put material in front of them where they have to do some kind of writing and expression, and it shows up in the material they write because it's consuming their whole mind. Like it's the only thing they can write or write about at all. They often will not come tell you these things with their mouth. It's gonna show up in their writing, and English teachers tend to receive it. So I read this thing and I immediately was like, oh my God. And so I'm like, Birdie, can you come over here real quick? She comes over to my desk and she sits down, and I said, I need to talk to you about your essay. You know, that turned into a 2-hour conversation. The kind of conversation where I know for a fact I cannot let this kid leave my sight because I don't know what that kid's gonna do, because now that somebody knows what they're thinking about doing, that's when they're at the greatest risk of something happening. As my students come in and out, at this point, like 3 class periods about to come and go, right? Kids come in and I'm not teaching today. I'm like, hey, read a book. You know, like read a book, and here's a little writing prompt. I wrote it up on the board, you know? Like, stay busy. I don't have time for you today because I now need to spend every piece of energy I have to get this kid to go with me to that counseling office in our schools. Now, we were blessed at my campus in Texas to have had the funding available to have a crisis counselor on campus whose only job is to deal with kids in crisis. You know, they were not academic counselors whatsoever, just crisis counseling. I wish more schools had that. And I'm sad that that poor woman had to do it for 2,100 kids alone. I wish she had other people working with her. It takes me 2 hours, but I finally get this kid in to go with me. And I said, all right, would you like me to stay? Do you want to talk to the counselor alone? From here, you're in charge. I got you in a room with the counselor. What would you like? She asked me to stay for a few minutes, and then it crossed the threshold where it was about to get much more private in that talk. And so I excused myself, and that was the last time I saw that kid for 2 weeks. Not because they harmed themselves, but because the hornet's nest, it stirred up a home. It caused a Child Protective Services call. It caused all sorts of trauma in the household. Old wounds and old stories got drug up into the light. I mean, shit hit the wall for this kid because of that report. And she was so angry with me at first. Now, that happened to be my 4th period class, which was my lunch period class. And then just like the campus I teach at now, we would have 3 different lunch periods. And unfortunately, as I seem to have always been stuck in my career, I somehow always end up with the 4th period class that gets split in half with lunch down the middle. So this kid would just not come to class. What happened is when I'm standing by my door and greeting kids coming in during the passing period for the start of class, I would see her little head pop around the corner from the cafeteria. And she'd look me in the eye and then turn the other way angrily. I'd sit down on my log and go, present, because I didn't want her to rack up absences. She's here. She's in the cafeteria. I know where she's at. You know what I mean? And she had a close friend who would let me know that she's at school, right? That was in my sixth period class. And this friend would always just kind of keep me posted. She's here. She's just, she's just angry. She's raw, right? But after a couple of weeks of this, the kid came back to class and then slowly but surely started talking to me more, right? That's how I got more of that kid's story. Since that kid graduated high school, because she did, that was her 10th grade year. I don't know. I'm so glad she made it through that. This all happened literally 2 months before school shut down for COVID. I mean, this was 2020.
Yeah.
And so I spent a lot of time very nervous about her condition. But she was one of my few students that actually checked into my Zoom meetings twice a week for in-person check-ins. And so
I'm listening.
That situation is exactly what we talk about when we talk about mental health privacy for the kids.
Sure.
Like, she needed to be able to access support in a way that would have been beneficial to her to receive that support and service and not necessarily have stirred up the hornet's nest,
So,
and I think about her a lot when we talk about this bill. That had nothing to do with transness.
No.
Or abortions.
No.
That is a kid in deep crisis that needed mental health services, right? And when we talk about, well, what about the good parents? That's what everyone always comes up with. I'm a good parent. I don't want to be cut out.
And this isn't reflective on it. Yeah.
Today, as I told you earlier, before our little pre-meeting session, right? Speech and debate meeting. I'm coaching speech and debate again, and I put because this is kind of front and center. Our debate topic today: Washington schools should protect the students' rights to privacy for medical and mental health. I took the negative, opposition, as in we should not be passing these bills. And the students took the affirmative because they're students and that's the side they can side with more. And one of the arguments they bring up, and I thought was brilliant because it aligns with something I have said repeatedly about this. I promise y'all, I didn't coach anything into this. They didn't even know about this topic. I just threw it up on the board and said, let's debate. And I handed them copies of the legislative bills in case they wanted to look at the legislative language or whatever. But everything else was their own head. These are teenagers doing this work on their own. And one of the arguments they made was good parents will have established the kind of trusting relationship with their kids that when they go to access that service, the kids will let the parents know because they have a trusting relationship. And that blew my mind to hear from the kids because as an adult, I had to do a lot of work to get there. We had our own nightmare scenario with one of our behavioral health centers in this area after we moved up here, where we were locked away from our kid for 3 days. I know what it's like to be a good parent locked out. It's hard. It's traumatic. It sucks. It's impossible. It was horrifying not to be able to talk to my kid because there's all these systems of blockage from us even being able to make sure he's safe. They wouldn't even tell us anything about him, because he didn't know he had to sign a document to give us permission, because he'd never been in the Washington healthcare system with such strong protections over his rights. And nobody would just go give him the form to sign. It was infuriating. But the one thing we had to really work ourselves back to is this isn't about, we are really furious at this situation because we weren't prepared for it. However, we recognize that there's kids who come from trauma and abuse in their homes where they wouldn't want their parents to be able to contact them yet or right now. And in that scenario, those kids deserve the safety and protection of this system, even if it's infuriating for us as the good parents. Our job is to be mad about how this has gone down for our kid and to advocate and fight for our access to our kid without making it about taking away a kid's right to stay safe from abuse and harm. And for people who've never been victims of abuse themselves, that's really hard to fathom.
So we're gonna pull it back really quickly to the bill aspect of things. So with Bernie, you have two different perspectives that you can go on, and that is one, trust building, right? Like you built that trust with Bernie. Even though you might have broken that trust eventually because of the fact that Bernie had built up that trust with you. So the big thing with the Parental Bill of Rights is a lot of teachers have spoken about the fact that trust building is incredibly important. Because if that is an abusive situation in the home, the kids need somebody to turn to that they trust, that they believe in, that will make some appropriate guidance or lead a good decision-making process. The other part is you as a mandated reporter. You have a whole different perspective than just the parent you, the teacher you has to make a report. With the parental bill, as it was a couple of years ago, the big issue was that the law in Washington states that a teacher has to tell a parent if they have found out that a student has run away, except in the fact of abuse. And the thing that led to the Parental Bill of Rights was the fact that Washington State recognized that many LGBTQ and trans youth that were running away from home might be doing so due to abuse after coming out or the fear of abuse before coming out. This was noticed and mentioned in the bill as coming from the Trevor Project. And so what we saw was a lot of parents who would go back to that whole it's my right to raise my kid as I see fit, regardless if you see that as abuse. And that spanking versus spankings of the parents that were I have been told that if I'm not okay with it, that is a form of abuse. And so you as a teacher, it's not your job. It's not your job to diagnose. It's not your job to make that call. It's your job to go, okay, this has been designated as a possible abuse case. I have to hand it off to DCYF. So am I off on that at all?
So again, several years ago, there was a kid who, I'm just going to borrow their nickname for themselves. So when I say this was their nickname, and it's kind of a ubiquitous sort of thing. So I don't think it gives away too much of the show here for this kid. They went by the name Rainbow.
So just really quickly, to kill or break down that secondary disclosure issue, in my work and in my experience, I have met hundreds of kids named Rainbow. So using a phrase like Rainbow is not going to be really
Correct.
Setting out who that kid is.
Right. And I've never really had, I guess I have sort of told Rainbow's story before, but Rainbow was a kid that came from a household that was a bit chaotic. And it is kind of vital to mention in this conversation that it's a Latino household, and they were living with their aunt for several years through middle school. And the aunt, very pro-LGBTQ. And this kid came out in middle school. It was known. Everybody. That's why this kid goes by the name Rainbow. Everybody knew Rainbow was exactly who Rainbow was, right? Rainbow, when I met Rainbow, was 10th grade. Rainbow always had, glorious nails and, makeup to the nines. Really excellently applied makeup, right? And they wore all the armaments of queer-codedness, right?
Sure.
As at the time, presenting gay male. And they owned that. They were proud of it, they were fierce, whatever, because Aunt had empowered them.
Mm-hmm.
But during their sophomore year, mom and dad came back into the picture. And I don't know why mom and dad were fully out of the picture, because as teachers, for all people think that we know everything, we don't. You know what I mean? I only mostly know whatever a kid tells me. So mom and dad came back into the picture. It got ugly. It got ugly for Rainbow, because Rainbow was the kind of kid, you talked earlier about the whole house and the communal stuff, right? How they learned to operate together and find healing in community. I find that fascinating because it reminded me even then of Rainbow. And I think that's why this story is really good. Rainbow got in trouble a lot. Rainbow was a huge pothead. Okay, Rainbow was a huge pothead and liked to ditch school. Honestly, I wasn't queer, but so much of the rest of Rainbow's story reminded me of my own. Just a person who's pretty bright, pretty intelligent. I didn't have some of the cognitive disability setbacks this kid had, so I didn't have as much struggle with school in that sense. Academically, I just really couldn't focus on schoolwork. But so much of the rest of our story, very similar, right? Hanging out with all the wrong people, doing all the wrong stuff, smoking weed, ditching school, all that kind of shit. So Rainbow, during her sophomore year, I had this conversation with Rainbow about 2/3 of the way through, because one of the things that would drive me crazy is I constantly had to redirect Rainbow back to task because they were always chatting. And every time I'd go up to Rainbow, I'd be like, Rainbow, come on, why are we talking again? They'd be like, I didn't start this conversation. They talked to me. They keep talking to me, and the kids around them are nodding their heads, Because Rainbow would sit there clacking her nails real loudly on the table, just clack, 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 just drawing attention to themselves, all the time. And I said, Rainbow, has it ever occurred to you that that you're actually a leader? And Rainbow said, no. I said, yeah. He's you have inherent traits of being a leader. I don't know if you recognize that. I believe you when you say you're not the one that starts talking. People come to you. Every time you're caught off campus, ditching, there's other kids with you. Well, I don't ask them to go. I'm just going and they just come with me. I was yes, that's what I'm trying to tell you. They look up to you. Even with your shenanigans, they look up to you. You are a born leader, and I want you to see that in yourself one day. Understand that people look to you for leadership. I was right now, you are a hurt person who has found other hurt people, and you guys are all looking after each other. And they follow you wherever you go because they look to you for that healing leadership. And the sooner you see that in yourself, the sooner you can lead them to healing and being in the right spaces and not getting in trouble instead of being elsewhere where they're not supposed to be. Well, that's the same year, again, that COVID shuts down. And I don't see Rainbow all the way through their junior year, right? No, wait, sorry. See, it's been so long. Junior year is when I'm having these conversations with them because I've taught them as a sophomore and then as a junior. Then COVID hits, I don't see them all the way through most of their senior year for hybrid learning until near the end of the year. Now, Rainbow had talked with me a bit about their sexuality and, their questioning of their gender. And I'm not one to offer people answers or advice because it's not my job. As you stated, I don't do that. Yeah. I say there are communities out there you should be tapping into for yourself to ask these questions. I was like, I can't offer you answers for that stuff. All I can tell you is that I support you in whatever you need to do for yourself. I'm here for you. When you need a safe place to come into, I want to encourage you. And the many times I've talked to you about being a leader, but there are communities you can tap into for this,